All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, 10 Ways to Take Your Test into the 21st Century. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You should see your GoToWebinar control panel in the upper right-hand corner of your computer screen. You have joined the presentation listening using your computer speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed there for you. If you have selected mic and speakers and are having any difficulty hearing me, please toggle the telephone option in your control panel and dial in. If you're experiencing any issues, please type the details into the question section of your control panel and I'll respond to you to resolve those as soon as possible. You do have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into that same questions pane of your GoToWebinar control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. Today's webinar is being recorded and you'll receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view the recording. All right, I would now like to introduce and turn things over to Andrew Krug, Selenium Conference Committee member and automated testing expert. Welcome, Andrew. You now have the floor.
Awesome, thanks. Thanks for that intro. Beats me having to do it for myself. As you said, I've been to go into a little bit more detail, I've been in test automation for my entire career. I'm now currently a consultant on Selenium for various companies. But you're not here for that. You're here about how to take your testing into the 21st century. So let's jump into it. There's going to be a variety of topics that are going to be covered. It's going to be covering the fluent testing pattern, method chaining, cascading, default objects, abstractions, Oracle testing, easy reporting, mobile and desktop testing, database for testing, and screen resolutions. So with anything like that should cover pretty much everyone's questions on how you test different things. And we're going to do it in very cool ways all the time. So the first bonus actually I have for you, which isn't on that list, is that I have a cheat sheet called the Write Less Code cheat sheet. If you sign up at that below URL, you can receive it once it's done. I have to do some polishing touches on it, but that is getting pushed off until after Selenium Conference Chicago, since I still have a few things to wrap up for that conference that's kicking off next week. Hope to see you there if you're planning on going. So going into the first three, the fluent pattern, method chaining, and method cascading, I'm bundling all these together so we can have a discussion about them because they all go together. They all go together because the fluent pattern is made up of method chaining and method cascading. Don't worry, there's still a whole lot here that we can dive into. So in case you don't know what method chaining is allowing every method call that you have in your code always returns an object. And when you return an object, that object obviously has other methods in it, and you can keep chaining your calls together. Method cascading is the exact same thing as method chaining, except you're initializing and returning that new object in the return call instead of pre-built one or this. And let's jump into the samples here. So here we have a somewhat complicated, let me move it over here. Okay, a somewhat complicated login form for a, like if you're signing up for like healthcare. So here we have within the class for the complete user profile page, we have these different methods: first name, last name, and birth date. And here we're just going to set them to fields that are within this user object, which we'll be jumping into shortly. And as you can see here, we're just doing a dot, and we're getting the exact, we're staying within the same class, but we're going to chain all the methods together. but I'll show you the code later. Well, I'll show you the code later. There's more complete examples later on. The default objects that I showcased there. Up here, we're we're reusing a user that's already been created in the database. Sorry, my screen's got out of whack. I don't know why. So here we have a new user. Reuse is true, so it's just going to search for a user that's already in our database. And we're setting a birth date to be equals just a new random date because we're going to update the birth date within the test. By doing it this way, we're never actually statically typing in any values. So every single time this test runs, it's going to be using a new object, which is very important in my opinion for writing really good automation tests. Drilling into it a little bit more, new user reuse equals true. Whoops, my bad. All right, sorry about that. The set birth date method, which is what we're doing to update it, if the user object already has a birth date associated with it, we're going to keep track of what the old date was, but we're going to update it with a new date. Doing this allows us to keep track of the changes within our test, and then we're going to do something really cool at the end with it. I promise you, it's really cool. Change values.put is a local hash map that's used so you can keep track of all the changes within our test. And that last call that we had in the test was db.validateUser, and we're just passing in a user object. Instead of passing all the different fields, we're just going to have that validate user call go through all the properties of the user and make sure that they validate to the ones that are stored in the database. So the cleaned up version, the full version of this test is we have homepage, go to login with user, go to settings, update birth date. As you can see, that is all exactly one line of code because all the methods are chaining with each other and they all return each other. So actually, you know what? I'm going to jump over to the code to show that to you. Let me make sure it's going to show up pretty. Where's this file? All right, there's the file. Wow, that took forever. Show IntelliJ idea. Okay, cool. I'm hoping everybody can see my screen. So here we have the different method calls there. Let's jump into them, and you can see that All these methods here, first name, last name, and birth date, all return this user info section, which is just a this instance in particular, which allows us to chain the calls together. The cleaned up version of it allowed for this just pass in the user object, which then is going to go ahead and do all the local calls anyways that are down below. All right, switching back to the presentation here. So moving somewhat on, we have the doing proper abstractions wherever you possibly can. Will make your day a whole lot easier, especially if you're not rewriting a whole bunch of files all the time. A lot of helper methods. And I know one of the, well, first off, if you're not using page objects, you just should. No, why is it not loading? Okay. It was just a little GIF of somebody saying do it. Now I know a lot of you probably have a lot of very large enterprise sites, and those sites have a lot of like different tabs and different forms, and generally the form pages get long. So you go into tab and sublevel, not heaven in particular with those, because it's hard to keep track of which tabs go where and what sublevels you need to be in and what form section you need to work in. And they are tricky, but you know what? Oh man, seriously, all my GIFs are not working. You gotta be kidding me. Oh well. And it's very easy to put all the items into wrong places. So because of that, we're going to try and make it easier on ourselves and reduce the cognitive load on us so that we can, we want to make everything simple as possible. So we don't have to think about where did we exactly store this particular section of this form, or where did we store this tab. And we don't have to put them all into one single class file that has thousands of lines. So let's show you how to break it down. Use the hierarchy that is already in place on the website and do exactly what the developers are doing. Break it down into components. So tabs are going to be defined in separate files. So here we have a sample directory structure of a setting sort of page. Here we have the setting base page. And this will be like the first page you get to when you land on the settings. And in this example, I'm just saying that there's a general settings page, and there's also a call settings like tab. And when you get to the call settings tab, there's two other sub pages or sub tabs within that call settings page, and they're all defined in separate files. But to use them, here we have our settings base page, where we can switch between the general settings page or the main, or this one in particular if we want to go back home. And the general settings page only needs to extend the settings base page. And what that looks like in practice is this. So my computer doesn't completely blow up. All right, so So here we're in that same settings page. And I can easily switch to the call settings or the general settings page. As you can't see, awesome. Let me throw a few lines in here. Switch to general settings. So as you can see there, I'm doing a whole lot of switching around there, and that's just because of the way the files were set up, which we'll jump into. So here we have the switch to settings page, switch to call settings, switch to video, change the settings there, go back to audio settings, go back to call, go back to general. From general, you can go to call settings and then go to the sub page of the audio tab, whichever. And you can do this at will whenever you want to. And what that looks like here, we'll go to the general settings page. So here we have the settings base page, which has both a call for switching to the general settings page or switching to the call settings page. And when you look at those, since those are extending the settings base page that we saw earlier, that allows you to use all the same methods that are already defined in the settings base. So this call settings base page has the switch to audio settings and switch to video settings, but it also has the call settings base page and general settings base page methods available to it. But we don't have to define them any more times because it's already been declared one already. Hope that cleared it up for everybody there. All right. Now, what about complex forms? We can do the exact same thing as, or well, you know, the forms that have the never-ending sections. Has anybody ever filled out the W1040 tax form online from the IRS.gov site? It is the worst thing ever because it's essentially one giant form. But you can split them up into, with the test code that you write, you can split up into different sections and maintain it easier. So what we're going to do is split up the different form sections and create methods that fill it in a whole lot faster for us. So here we have a class called, let me see here, called the user info section and another section called the spouse info section. Here we're just initializing both of them because we're going to fill it in from this complex form base page. Here we see we're just using the user form and the spouse info sections. The fill fields is doing the same thing as you saw earlier. You just pass on an object and it's going to take the values out of that object and put them into the proper fields. And this way you can keep the different info sections separately in their own files, especially when they get long. Like you can have some info sections, like for the medical. I've done the medical healthcare testing, and those forms are ginormous. Would be an understatement of the year, because you know it has like all your medical history, your family history, your current weight and blood pressure measurements, all your history of drugs and alcohol. And you can easily split up into different sections and maintain it a whole lot easier when you break it up. And then you just have one class that just gets all the proper field sections to use. And here there's the test itself. When you use the test, you'll just have to pass in the two different user objects that you're going to use, which beats having to pass in string first name, string last name, date, birth date, comma, and have thousands upon parameters for your methods. Using objects is so much cleaner. And there's the same filling in the efficient fields. So there's what the efficient filling in looks like. Passed in the user object, fill in the first name field with the user dot the property that's stored in the user dot first name, or the last name for the last name, birth date for the birth date. My bonus tip for you is have the directory structure of your pages be equivalent to the URL of the page, and that way you can easily determine where that file is located if you just look at the URL of the page that has an issue with it. If you see like if possible automation bug, or you're just debugging, you can just look at the URL, and that will lead you within the pages directory of your test framework, at least down to the right directory to look into. If you're using C#, there's a bonus tip for you. You can actually use a partial class for those super long complex objects, and that way you can store the different like form sections within their own class files. But if you call them partial class and you just have it one standard name, all those methods will be available to you as one class object, and but you still get to keep the files separately, which is pretty awesome to use. So all of that stuff is leading up to what I like to call oracle testing. And in all the examples I showed, there's very few static variables ever declared. And the reason why I do that is because for a very simple reason. Every execution will test something new. I don't know exactly what it's going to be testing new, but it's always going to be something new. It could be a new set of strings, new date. Well, typically, if I'm to call a new user object, it's actually generating a brand new user object from scratch. So completely different username, first name, last name, username, passwords, dates, addresses, the whole 9 yards. And doing that on every test execution will raise the confidence of your test suite. Whereas statically typed test suites does not do that. And in all actuality, if you have new development work that was done and put in place, and you have no new tests, and if you run the test and you have no change in test results, you will actually have less confidence than you had before, because the delta for the development work has changed, but your test results cannot do anything about it. And also, when you use statically defined, one of my massive production bugs that occurred was the developers used the exact same list I was testing against to create a brand new feature for a particular set of users. And what that came out during the deployment when we tested other user accounts. What the developers did was that they actually modified the user accounts to have this feature flag that says, oh, they're allowed to have this, whereas the new feature was supposed to be enabled for groups of clients. So once that happened, I said, never again am I ever statically typing in a single user account, because if the developers use the exact same one as I'm anticipating, then they might just modify the record to make it work. Which was a fun production bug at 3 a.m. So Now, if you're to implement all that, you now have this huge headache of having really good test reports. Before, if you were doing statically typed variables, you can have the same steps written in your test case management software, and you can easily reproduce from that. However, implementing all the stuff I showed you, you don't know exactly what got inputted by the test framework. So you now need the test framework to report on itself, like what did it actually type in. So first thing we're going to show off is the Allure reports, which I still like. I love it because it's a very pretty report. And I can assure you, project managers love pretty reports. Easier to, and what I mean by pretty reports is that they're easier to digest and get the information you need out of it. One of the main particular features of Allure is that you can have substeps and define substeps within it. And those are also known as those pesky details that actually need to be followed to actually properly reproduce the issue. So how do we track that? So let me jump into it here. Here we have a Allure report that got generated. Let's go to, let's check out this test that the blog page loads. I don't know why it's. So here we have the the test report for this particular story. Make sure that the blog page loads. So here we have the setup, and here we can actually see the different substeps. So here it's saying it's going to test in production. It's testing on the latest version of Chrome, and the base URL is my home site of lazycoder.io. It's going to create a new driver and go on from there. So here we're going to, the test itself, once it goes to the home page, it's then going to find the blog link. So here we're clicking on the blog link up at the top, and when you set it up properly, you can get nice little images within the test report, so it's very clear on what got clicked. Huh. Interesting. So there's the actual element that got clicked on, and it's in the report, and you can follow through easily, but it's very clean, easy to digest. Validate that the current URL is correct, and make sure that the title is correct as well. And then tear down. In my tear down, because this example, actually I have it taken a screenshot of the page. There it is. And then just paste it in just so you saw what you can see what the end result is as well. And we'll see that in a little bit more detail momentarily. And actually doing it this way, you can actually have all of the parameters that you're passing in show up here as well. So you can see exactly what got typed in at every step. We're getting close to the end here, so if you want to start adding in more questions, chat box, go ahead. Now, screen resolutions, which are always a pain to test, especially since pretty much every website in the world now is responsive. So how do we address it with our test framework easily? Well, if you're going to do it, you're obviously going to be focusing in on the breakpoints. And you need to make sure you test around the breakpoint. So at the breakpoint, and then one above it and one below it, make sure it all still works. And one thing you have to make key note of is that you have to test the proper viewport, not the window size. Now, what I mean by that is that if this square box here is your screen, and those are the very small frame around it. This red border would be the browser window. So down there at the bottom, you can see there's a massive gap there. And like if that was a Windows browser or Windows operating system, not browser, that would be like the start bar, or it could be Chrome OS's start bar. So obviously the window size is smaller than the screen resolution. And even more detail, that blue line, the blue dots, is the actual viewport. As you can see, there's spacing up at the top, and that's going to be like the URL bar, your bookmarks bar, your tabs, all at the top there. Along the right-hand side, it's going to be like your scroll bar. Down at the bottom, it's going to be the horizontal scroll bar as well, which shouldn't actually exist if it was a proper responsive site. But you still might have some of those, especially on those like healthcare forums. They never really make it usable from a phone. So that blue area is where you need to make sure you're testing the breakpoints. And that's actually a key thing that more people should know about. I'll go with that. And now we want to apply that to the Oracle, because I don't want to write a particular set of tests that work on the desktop that don't work on mobile. We can still do that. But for the most part, everything that works on a desktop web page on the desktop should work on a mobile phone as well. But the layout will probably change, and some new actions might need to occur. So within the affected method is where you're going to be doing this modification. So here we have the go to blog method call, and here we're doing a if statement, where if is mobile, it's going to have to click on a menu button initially instead of just clicking the blog page navigation link, and then return a new blog page. So that is mobile is just going to make sure that the window size, which is within the driver.manage window, that is the viewport, actually, is less than or equal to 800. That happens to be where my breakpoint is for my page. Return true, else go ahead and return false. So going back to the Allure report, here we have the mobile blog page loads, and I'll show it to you actually. Here you can see that it's going to click on the menu toggle, then it's going to click on, and there's a little picture of it, click on the menu toggle, then click on the blog link. Now what that test looks like, okay, let me just clean this up a little. Let me just move it around a little bit. So here we have the blog page, and here we have the test for the mobile page. Homepage, go to blog, title should be expected. Make sure the title is correct. Mobile blog page, homepage, go to blog, title should be expected. The only difference here is that we're specifying that we want a specific window size. That's going to force it to go to the breakpoint. And that way it's going to have the mobile layout show up, which is going to have to click on that menu button that I showed earlier. This part could be easily abstracted out to have it just in the driver setup inside the driver setup, so that you can have one less thing to worry about. There we go. Jump back to where we were. Cool. Now, obviously, if you have different layouts for tablets or super wide desktops or whatever, what have you, you can obviously modify this and have it do a return an enum value that says what type of layout it should be, like mobile, tablet, or desktop as well. So now that we're doing all that, and we have the test report showcasing what values are being put into the test, we now need a better way of managing all of those. Sorry. Better way of managing all those different values that are being created. And I like to spin up a Elasticsearch instance because it's awesome and free to dump all the data in there. Now, I could easily use a MySQL instance or a standard SQL sort of server. MySQL, Microsoft SQL, doesn't matter. However, I like the NoSQL database for testing purposes because I do not want to think about how I'm structuring the data within the database. And since Elasticsearch is a NoSQL database, I can just dump in a JSON of whatever values I want, and it will store it in there every single time. So, in one of the instances that I use it in is whenever I create a new user. The first thing we're going to do is create a map string object, and I'm just calling it record just because it makes it clean, easier to use later on. Here we're adding the date, and that's the local date time now .toString, which is the current time that it's going to get put into the database, so you can even keep track of when users got created for historical reasons. just because actually. Here we're going to put the value of user record to be equal to the object of user. This is the standard connect to this particular cluster of Elasticsearch, but here's the important bit right here. Put it into the test users index. It's a document type of user, and then push that information to it. What you're going to get in return is response.getID, and that's the unique ID for it. And then you can just put that ID within the test report and just put it into the test report. So you have user ID equals the hash that is created. Now, what that allows you to do is that you can now search for any of the records you ever create, either by the test name, whatever user record, the data changed. The user object itself actually has the whatever values got changed, so you can even spot if there is a particular bug associated around changing a particular type of value, like of people that are changing their birth date or to December are having issues. Obviously, that's not probably a you can, by dumping all the data into Elasticsearch, you can easily search through and parse your information however you want. You might even find new correlations that you didn't even know of before as well. Now, the biggest issue is if you have to recreate an issue. And you happen to know that this particular user, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, managed to create it. Now, all you have to do is go to the test run and get the record ID from that. and you're going to be copying it because we're going to just use it. You're then going to clone the test, link it to the associated bug, either through test case management software or through like a LoR's TMS connection link. And then get the record from Elasticsearch and use that record for the test. Now, it seems probably counterintuitive for the cloning of the test, but there's an actual reason for it. Besides the fact that you can link it to the test case management software that you have, or your bug list. Eventually, we're going to want to delete this record, delete this test, because we do not want this test to be in our system. If it's a reoccurring bug, you might just want to comment it out in the meantime until it becomes stabilized if you're having to constantly bring it back. But eventually you're going to want to delete this test because it doesn't provide you much value. That test is making sure a particular bug doesn't come back. You can move it over to a regression test suite if you would like to, but there's very little value you get out of running the same test over and over again. Excuse me. Now, the burning question that I'm sure everybody has is, what about mobile devices? Instead of just running the test across different screen resolutions on your desktop. As a forewarning, that's supposed to be learn. Sorry for the complete misspelling of the words there. Not even using the right word, actually. Your minds are about to get blown. You have been warned. So this is a very crude example, but it's just showcasing it for you. Here if the properties that we're setting initially has a browser of mobile Safari, we're going to set the desired capabilities of mobile capability type. Browser name equals Safari. URL is your Appium hub, a new Appium driver. If not, we're just going to use a local instance of Chrome driver. If you notice, the driver is the exact same reference as up here as the class level variable of WebDriver. And in case you didn't know, the Appium driver extends the remote WebDriver. Because of that, you can use all the same page objects that you've already created for the desktop, and you can easily use it on a mobile device. All this code here is just going to connect to a local Appium driver and then spin up the test and run the same test. There's probably going to be a few extra steps to make sure that actually, no, there's no other extra steps. It's going to open up the Safari browser by default because we're specifying Safari up here, and then it will begin your test and just proceed as usual. Navigate to the URL you're testing and do all the same actions. By doing that, you can have your one project can then be testing mobile devices, mobile browsers, and desktop browsers, all with the same code base, which is super awesome. I've done it I've done it in extreme detail twice. I've done shorter examples of it a few times, but it is so cool when you get to do that because then you can easily write a test that targets any device you want within your grid. Or, if you're connected to SOS, you can test it across any devices. And successfully have your minds blown. And that image works. Seriously? None of the other ones work, but that one does. But that's okay. It's an awesome image. So as an extra bonus for all you sauce labs, I have a Selenium bundle. Currently, if you use the discount code of Awesome Sauce, there's a 15% discount until October 24th. And it's time for everyone's favorite time, the Q&A section.
Thank you, Andrew. That was good. I'm glad these gifts are working. Do have a few questions for you, so bear with me one moment. First up is, this was toward the beginning of the presentation. You keep mentioning every test will have a new user. How is that when your tests have reuse equals true? I think that means you use an existing user every time, not a new one.
Yeah. Okay. So that one, it's reuse equals true. But what it's going to actually do is just get a user from the database that's not going to be using the same user. If you remove that reuse equals true value from it and just leave it parameterless, it's going to do one from random, complete random. So you can move on to the next question while I showcase that code.
Okay. Actually, I did have a couple of questions about the bit.ly URL that you presented at the front. So after you showcased the code, maybe we can throw that back up. We did say, is the URL sign up active at this point? I know you had mentioned that you were doing some cleanup.
The sign up for the cheat sheet?
Yeah.
Yeah, it should. Yeah, that's live.
Okay. Well, we'll double check that.
You should get an email that says to confirm your email address.
Okay.
And then you're in the system, so I can send it out to you when it's polished up a little bit.
Okay. Am I able to rattle off another question while you're looking for the code?
Yep.
Okay. Barry writes, are you aware of any custom or commercial test frameworks that can test multiple interfaces? For example, creating a record using an API, then modifying it using mobile app and desktop browser.
Commercially,
well, custom or commercial.
From a commercial standpoint, your closest bet's probably going to be something from formerly Telerik. What is it now?
Okay.
Progress something Progress now. That's going to be your closest bet. I typically just make them all custom because then I have full control over everything. And I do it typically through. So here in this code, actually, I'm just doing a DB call get user. That's not supposed to be give me that, but that's just supposed to get a random user at that particular point in time. But here, if you instead of create a new user, what you could do here is just do a database call to create the new user. So just DB call or API call, pass in these values and create the new user from that point. Hope that answers the question. We can go to the next question.
Okay. Christopher writes, what do you mean by deleting tests? Deleting the Java files you have coded or the test results?
Oh, so that was when I was talking about when I clone the test to reproduce a particular bug. That clone I don't want to keep around within the test framework because it's not going to provide any new value. You can migrate that over to a regression test framework if you have enough time to run regression tests. But in my point of view, it doesn't provide that much value. A better workflow around it would be to keep leave it in your test framework for a few different releases. If it hasn't come back, then go ahead and just comment it out. So it's no longer going to get executed, and that it's another test that's running that's not providing a lot of value, and will somewhat shorten your test cycle.
Okay, thank you for that. Here's a question that is going to require me to, I believe, read a little string of code, but it's an interesting one.
Okay.
How does method chaining offer quicker fault identification? He writes, would test method dependency, parenthesis, at symbol test, parenthesis, depends on equals, quotation, quotation, close paren, not offer the same chaining result, but with the added benefit of a more granular overview of test results, plus less waiting for chain methods to fail?
Could you send that to me in the chat?
Yeah, I'll send it to you in the chat. And in the meanwhile, I'll ask, do you have elements like menu and footer links that are shared between pages in your base page or in separate classes? Any best practices for how to deal with elements links that are common between pages?
If it's within the same hierarchy, I'll just have that as a new base. So one example would be in like a logged in user base versus an admin base, which might have a completely different links entirely. And there would just be two different bases that just inherit the super base page. And that way I can easily share the different links.
Okay. I'm afraid I'm going to have to send you the question separately because the chat window is not working for me right now. I apologize for that.
No worries. If not, you can send it to me and I'll just do it as a short post on my site.
Okay.
A response to it.
The beach ball right now. Doug Noel writes, can you define a breakpoint in this context? That came in about halfway through the presentation.
Okay, I think I showed that off when I did the breakpoint in the middle of the method. If that doesn't answer, I just go ahead and re-ask it.
Okay. What can be the best and stable reporting options other than Allure?
I primarily use Allure because it works across all the different languages I'm consultant, so I don't have to relearn different ones all the time. I have started messing around with reportportal.io. It can provide a lot of value to see how you're doing from a testing perspective, but it doesn't go into the level of detail I would like for reporting it to business, which is the primary reason you're creating a test report. But that's why I just use Allure, because I'm always the syntax is similar across any programming language I'm working in, so I don't have to relearn the wheel every single time. That's all.
Okay. Well, I think we've come to the end of the Q&A session, and I want to thank you again, Andrew, for your time. We will send out an email with a link to the recording and Andrew's slides in a couple of days. We'll also include the bit.ly link and the promo code to the asset that Andrew showed at the end of the presentation. If any of you are in Chicago next week, come stop by the Selenium conference. It'll be 2 days of great presentations from folks like Andrew. And I want to thank everyone for their time. We'll see you on the internet.